see she feels the enlightenment has left us. But I am going to now hand over to our chair for the evening, Michael Brown. Michael is a professor at the School of Divinity, History and Philosophy at the University of Aberdeen. He is a historian of Ireland, Scotland and Britain more widely, with particular interest in the Enlightenment and the political culture of the 18th century. He is the co-director of the Research Institute of Irish and Scottish Studies. Thank you. So I'll hand over to Michael now.
Thank you indeed, Julie, and welcome everybody to this evening, and thanks very much for joining us in the Linen Hall. I'm delighted to be able to take up the invitation to have a conversation this evening. I'm particularly delighted to be able to converse with the novelist, scholar, lecturer in psychiatry, literary and art critic, and a memoirist, Siri Hustvedt. As this suggests, it's very, very hard to capture and categorize her diverse range of her writings and the broad curiosity that's on show throughout her work. It is, however, I think, characterized by humanity and freshness and a crisp intellectual clarity that makes her work a joy to encounter. She's been widely recognized, for instance, receiving the Princess of Asturias Award for Literature and the International Gabarron Prize for Thought and Humanities. Her most recent book, which is the prompt for this evening's conversation, is entitled Mothers, Fathers and Others, New Essays. Published by Sceptre, which is an imprint of Hodder and Stoughton, last year, this extraordinary sequence of essays, meditations and critiques circles around issues of personal and social identity, artistry and recollection, and birth and creativity. Now, for those of you who haven't yet read it, I can only say, please do. It's a vital piece of writing, which I think, which thinks through many of our current dilemmas, expressing a kind of imaginative resistance to some of the polarities that have defined what passes for public debate in our current climate. So I want to thank you, Siri, for taking up the invitation to join us this evening, and to begin by asking you to reflect on how, in a sense, the mixed legacy of the Enlightenment, which is the title for this evening's conversation, with its concerns for equality, categorization, individual autonomy, and social control, how that mixed legacy sits in relation to what you term in the conversation we had earlier, your intellectual geographies.
Yeah, this is something that is important to me, because I think what's happened is that not among scholars, but in the general public, an idea of what the Enlightenment was has been inherited, and we have sometimes what I think of as cartoon versions of that Enlightenment. Steven Pinker, for example, wrote a book about the Enlightenment that is, I think, just appallingly crude. But that's what gets publicized. And I do think, looking at what I think of as a mixed legacy, right? If you take a couple of ideas, say something that remains very important in democratic discourse, the idea of equality and what that means. This is born during that period. I mean, the Greeks did not have that kind of democracy that was opened up, right, at during the Enlightenment. What happened immediately thereafter, right, is that how limited is this equality, right? In the United States Constitution, despite the Declaration of Independence, where, you know, you say all men are created equal. Well, it was white men with property in that understanding. And of course, in France, what happened was the debates began. So do Black people, do slaves count, right? And there were many philosophes who stood against slavery, but did not want women to have equal rights. That was also a lively debate. So we can see how one idea that we can take from the Enlightenment is crucial now, right? Also defenses of property, another issue, right?
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me immediately that one of the things that you tease out in the book is the ways in which that very idea of the individual, that premise on which those individual rights and that right-bearing individual that is found in Locke, is found in the Declaration of Independence, is in fact sort of contradicted by some of the ways in which you think about the individual as I think you describe it as somebody is constantly invaded by other things, by whether it be in reading a book and having their mind taken over by a narrator, or to speak to current concerns, the ways in which a virus might inhabit the body and be a kind of lived organism within your own body, that human beings are not autonomous and separate selves. I think that's one of the central challenges that you're posing, I think.
Yes, and I think, again, human beings develop and gain reflective self-consciousness, right? We're able to reflect on ourselves as if we were others. That's one of the gifts that human beings have. And perhaps other animals have it, but we don't really know. And we don't know to what degree. If you think about the gift of literacy, a late gift that human beings have, this is sort of the ultimate version of reflective self-consciousness. So the Enlightenment, many, not all, right, but many in the Enlightenment worship this idea about our ability to reflect and rationalize and discuss and be skeptical, right? All of these are important to the Enlightenment. One of the problems that I point out in the book and have been working on for a long time is that what has happened in the Western tradition, and by the way, in other traditions, but I just happen to know better the Western tradition, is the complete suppression of human origin inside the body of another person, right? So and also the strange inability to look at what is in fact the truth, that mixing is what reproduction is, right? It's you have a diploid cell that makes a journey, and this is a very complex bit of business, gestation and then birth. This has been cut off. I mean, Plato talks about birth, but he makes it very clear that the birth of ideas from a philosopher's head are a lot more important than, the being that comes out of a female body. And Aristotle, of course, too. But these were very hierarchical thinkers, right? And the feminine is always denigrated. And then that denigration goes on. And it's partly a failure to recognize that we begin entwined and that we need to think not just about the autonomy of the individual, which is, I really believe it's important. And because I spent 4 years as a volunteer writing teacher for psychiatric patients, I came to understand how in certain people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia and lose their anchor as separate from others, to the degree that some patients will even confuse pronouns. I've told this story before, but it's a wonderful one. A psychiatrist, a friend of mine, had a session with a man diagnosed with schizophrenia, and she had just been to the hairdresser and had her haircut, and he sat down in the chair opposite her. She sat down, and he looked at her and he said, "Oh no, you cut my hair." So we need to understand boundaries to live, but we also need to pay attention to what happens in the between sphere, between two people or in a group, and also understand that human beings are porous, quite literally porous, right? Yeah. Food goes in us, it comes out of us, right? Erotic coupling is, forms of entrance and mingling. So I think this gets shunted to the side often in the philosophical tradition.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that I picked up on in the book is the ways in which that kind of occlusion of the physicality of human beings and their origins isn't just a classical trope. You rightly point out the Heidegger is in some ways a philosopher de guerre he thinks about thrownness as if we magically appear in the world. And yet,
Exactly.
so one of the things that I was interested in is the ways in which natality start to play into your
Yeah.
ideas, and the question of what it is then to imagine a bornness rather
Right.
than sort of being thrown into something. You're born into something, because it seems to me that you're doing something more though than merely emphasizing the physical in that. The challenge in a sense is not to emphasize the materiality, is to say that materiality informs and shapes the intellect, because it goes back to your concern about the mind-body dualism that the Enlightenment co-opted in many ways successfully, and that's what has to be overcome.
Yeah, and I think what's fascinating, I mentioned her earlier before we were formally talking, Margaret Cavendish, 17th century natural philosopher and playwright, kind of author of proto novels, if you will. When I first encountered her, I had the feeling, I think, that Virginia Woolf did when she goes, "Who is this crazy woman?" And I sank into this work and I realized that she, before some people officially begin the Enlightenment, is an anti-Cartesian and anti-Hobbesian. She's a complete materialist, but she does not believe that there is a difference between psyche and soma. She's a radical critic of the tradition that then would become ours, right? She read everybody, Descartes, very, very carefully and closely, and does a lot of pushing back against this kind of dualism that we've all inherited. I have found it extremely difficult to talk to people who aren't immersed in the mind-body problem about what it is.
Yeah.
I mean, people, you have to really go very, very slowly. I wrote a whole long essay, 200-page essay about this called The Delusions of Certainty. And I understood that Descartes, even in the sciences, has become so ingrained in our ways of thinking that so it's Descartes or Hobbes, right? Either it's different or we're just machines, right? And so that kind of mechanism, which is a product of the scientific revolution and thinking about matter as dead, is countered in Cavendish by saying that all matter is animated.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah, and I think the other side of it, that coming out of that materialism question is, I mean, it's a number of ways we could respond to that, but one of the things that strikes me is how much it speaks to one of the key essays, I think, in this book, which is about Wuthering Heights, and the ways in which Bronte puts together a kind of landscape which is genuinely alive. And it's not, you rightly say, the novel is itself actually about the place as much as it's about the characters that inhabit it. And it's the ways in which that becomes a living organism. And that speaks, I think, to one of your responses, perhaps, which is, I mean, I dwell on the fact that you're a successful novelist in your own right, in terms of not just the critical writings. The novel is, as I was seeing it, was a response in some ways to that mind-body problem. And it's showing that art is itself alive. You say at one point in this book that books are kind of living organisms when they're being read. They're alive when they're being encountered. And it seems to me that's one way to think about how art might challenge the mind-body problem.
That's right. John Dewey, a philosopher I admire, in Art as Experience, talks about the organic clicks that happen when you're reading. He talks about poetry in particular, but this happens with all art. We don't just register the meaning of signs when we're reading, perhaps especially a novel, or are gripped by a novel. This is an embodied emotional experience and a thinking experience with organic clicks, right? Tension, relaxation, and and you know, that echo the rhythms of our own bodies in many ways, I think. So that embodied turn, and this of course has happened in cognitive science, there is an embodied turn because the neo-Cartesian idea that, you know, the mind is a computational system that can be attached to any form of material, right? Either silicon and wires or an actual living human body, ran into so many dead ends that it had to be revised. Yeah.
I think that's fascinating, because one of the achievements that's often put forward by Enlightenment scholars for the Enlightenment, when they talk about the Enlightenment, is precisely that sense of the capacity for the mind-body problem to separate out from the material problems and to create a kind of abstracted intellect that will allow for generalization, that will allow, I mean, you can see it in the ways in which medics are taught not to become personal with their patients, that part of the challenge is just create a sense of distance. And it leads to one of the questions that the audience has raised about whether or not you perceive any sense in which a point of view can be understood as properly established, or are we in a kind of post-foundational environment where it becomes simply my perception over somebody else's perception, and we inhabit this almost solipsistic landscape at times, where we're stuck with only our point of view and we need to reach out beyond.
Well, I think this is, of course, an ultimate question, right? In many ways. I have been, in a way, an advocate of plural truths that are perspectival. And at the same time, I think, you know, the absolutely floating every argument as good as every other is ridiculous. And I think we have to start thinking, as, you know, in collective thought about, are there human values that we want to protect? And how do we know that those human values, you know, are what they are? You know, they obviously change from culture to culture. And at the same time, is there total cultural relativity when it comes to questions of hurting other people in various ways? For example, I mean, I do think that there are some communitarian values that, you know, we hope that there can be some collective consensus on, or at least among people who want to defend actually democratic pluralism.
Reminds me again of one of the passages in the book, which I found fascinating, which is a kind of defense of empathy, and the ways in which you describe empathy as something, the ability to think past oneself. It's a way past the solipsism, perhaps, and to think about, by putting yourself imaginatively into somebody else's position, and to empathize with that, not necessarily to agree or to justify it, but to understand how people came to think the way they think, or to act the way they did. On that grounds, in a sense, art might be one of the ways past that sort of more rigid sort of structure of
and I think I mean, we don't have to be as radical as Martin Buber, but Martin Buber really thought about this place between people as an ontological reality, right? If you think about it in your own life, I have like two perfectly nice seeming people can create a monster between them, right? But we also know that genuine contact creates what Ogden, a psychoanalyst, calls the third. It's very similar to Buber's idea that actually between people, something else is created. And attention to that space, I think is really important. And partly it means pulling down some of our conceptual boundaries that are so established we just forget, right? They're automatic. right? The mind is one thing, the body is another thing. Or, you know, I end at my finger here, you know, my skin is my end. Well, it's not really your end. And I mean, thoughts are communicated through language too. And language is a collective reality, right? It has to be shared. I mean, Wittgenstein was right. There is no such thing as a private language.
I think, yeah, this could take us in a couple of directions, but I just want to tease out one bit of this and then perhaps head into the other direction, which is, I mean, in terms of thinking about the limitations on the person, one of the things that's perhaps fascinating to me about the ways in which you've described your own working habits and the ways in which you think about the boundary lines is precisely that it's all lived in the kind of mess between art and literature and science.
Yeah.
And it's, in some ways, that's where the interesting thoughts are happening, is in that messy middle between the disciplines. And I guess one of the things that I was going to raise with you at one point is about how far, in a sense, that's aided or hampered by what we might think of as the information revolution we're now living through, where if I want to read a scientific paper, I can. If I want to read somebody blogging about science, I can. How do you understand that mess? Is that mess getting bigger? Is it getting smaller? How do we cope with the wave of material that's coming at us?
I think and this relates, I think, directly to the Enlightenment and science is, and this goes back again, right? It's really Galileo that, well, if you want, you can even take it back to Plato, right? And geometry or Pythagoras, right? So it's the faith in numbers, that numbers convey a kind of truth that other forms do not have, right? And so the algorithm, which now has become the way things happen, it is digital. I mean, it's, you know, yes or no, it's X's or zeros or ones and zeros. And that kind of rigid formulation has taken over all forms of communication. And this is a little scary, I think, because now there are models that include like fuzzy logic and, you know, all this stuff. I mean, it's not always that, right? And people are talking about quantum computing and, you know, all kinds of stuff is going on that I don't fully understand. But I think that this faith in numbers, faith in statistics, faith in data, as if data is an objective, that data reveals itself, right? It's as if nobody has to gather it, right? And you can take this, and that somehow, you know, we're on the road in some circles to becoming, you know, supermen, right? That we'll be able to download our minds into computers and live forever. I mean, this is a fantasy in transhumanism. And some of these very powerful rich guys are into transhumanism. That's why they're going into space. They're going to colonize there. But yeah, I think we have to examine why generally the culture believes that the statistical and numerical methods of science are superior forms of knowledge, I think, to other forms of knowledge. I mean, what I'm for is we're not going to change the scientific method. What I think is that if you take a number of different models, including, you know, novels and philosophy, and ask the same question, you won't get the same answer. But you will get a focused zone of ambiguity, which will allow you to ask the next better question. I'm kind of, you know, I think this can be done. Yeah. I mean, the problem is that specialization create groups of people who know so much about one thing. And you mention to them the Scottish Enlightenment and they'll go, what?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, they just have, and also scientists, for example, have no knowledge of the history of their own field, because that was jettisoned. All that matters is the papers published this year. Or doctors. I mean, a lot of psychiatrists have no clue about the history of psychiatry, and it's, you know, not that long, modern psychiatry. I think this is a real problem.
I think that goes to a question I was partly going to pick up from the chat, which is about the importance of narrative in all of this, and the ways in which, you know, the 18th century was very much the age of the novel. Bring us back to the Enlightenment. One of the counterpoints to the kind of scientific developments you're describing was this creation of interior monologue, and you see the emergence of the idea of the individual as having a perspective and an understanding. So you move from the kind of Defoe hero, which is very much an actor, through to by the time you get to the turn of the 19th century, is somebody like Jane Austen's heroines, who are thinking on the page and are remarking and commenting on the social environment they find themselves in. So I guess one of the questions I have about that, and to pick up on the question in the chat, is the role you see in narrative building, whether it's the history of a discipline or the history of an individual character in this, because the question that was put is about how the importance of reading fiction is currently being undervalued, particularly amongst people in power. As you're saying, there's an obsession with STEM subjects, there's an obsession with STEM education, and there seems to be, as the question puts it, an element of surprise in the United States that Obama, as a president, was reading fiction. Yes. And of course, in counterpoint, we've had other presidents who are decidedly not reading fiction. And the same thing could be said of prime ministers in Britain and elsewhere, you know, and political leaders elsewhere. What do you see as the role of that narrative building in that structure?
Well, I do think that narrative is rooted in physiology, right? So that human beings, every human culture that we know about is a storytelling culture, right? Not every culture that we know about is, you know, doing what we now call science, right? Or technology. But you know, I think what happens is that the early relationship of an infant with its caretaker, you know, parent or parents, that those exchanges are rhythmic. And, you know, before the child knows any language, develops, actually, a psychoanalyst, and oh God, it will come to me, calls the pre-narrative envelope. It's kind of a nice term. Pre-narrative envelope through these, and he took this from Suzanne Langer's discussions of music, the American philosopher, and he credits her for inspiring him to look at, he was looking at mothers and children pretty much exclusively, and their musical interactions. I also think, I mean, I've written a paper on this in a fairly obscure journal that talks about, you know, what we all know is that we're rhythmic beings, right? And, you know, we have heartbeat, we breathe, you know, until we die, all that is happening. There's rhythms outside us that become incorporated into our circadian rhythms. You know, the tide goes in and out. All this is part of life. And I think what we have a tendency to do is to fix everything into these ontological categories that limit us, right? There's a philosopher of biology that I really like, whose name is John Dupre, and he repeats this throughout his work. He says, organisms are not things, but processes, right? So if we, you know, we don't have to, I think, throw out ontology altogether. Again, this is maybe the way I work intellectually, but I think that offers a corrective to the fixity of category that began to be really established during the Enlightenment. And of course, taxonomies change, but I resist those categories, not because I have a new taxonomy, but because I think the resistance of those borders helps us to think better.
Yeah, it's a good example, that transition between the scientific understanding and music theory. A good example of exactly the mixture that you're describing being productive. But one of the things that strikes me a bit about the ways in which that narrative works, I like this idea of life as a process, and creatures are organisms are processes, not just things. They're not static, they're in movement. But I guess that begs the question we've talked already at the start in the conversation about bornness. The other end of this is the question of death, of course, but there is a sense of an ending that pursues, and the scientific endeavor for living forever, however egotistical that might be, is an attempt in a sense to escape those natural processes. I guess that's one of the questions that's at the heart, in a sense of one of the areas in which that actually does happen is in a sense in art, that these objects live on past their maker. They live on through the imaginations of others. So there's a kind of tension there, I think, between the kind of sense of an ending of the organism and the artistry that's produced. You describe in the book at length Borges's work and the ways in which she challenged some of the stereotypes. She's open up constantly to new interpretation at this point. It's suddenly a much more fecund field, but she herself is not there to comment on it.
Exactly, and I think, I mean, again, one of the reasons I think Louise Bourgeois has become such a large figure in the art world is that she's also being re-seen in some sense in a new context, right? And that all of our perceptions are also in motion, right? They're in motion because, as the brilliant Kierkegaard said, there's no exact repetition because things are happening in time, right? So you can remember, but you're not repeating exactly. He also says, of course, without repetition, everything would be just void, empty noise. There would be nothing. So we need forms of patterned repetition in order to understand life. But we should also recognize that we are temporal creatures. The stuff, I mean, I really think it's wonderful, right, that we have books and art objects so that we are in conversation with the dead. It's one of the great things about human life is that we can do that. Any culture that has forms of representation that last, that isn't destroyed, has the ability to converse, to interact with what went before them, the ancestors.
It's fascinating because it makes sense of one of the extended passages in the book, which opens the sequence, which is your encounter with your engagement with your background, and particularly your grandmother and your mother and the kind of matrilineal line, which I read, I have to admit, and this goes to this point about the encounters with the dead, as a kind of series of ghost stories, the ways in which you continue to be haunted by the presence of people who have passed. And part of it is a kind of way in which it speaks. I mean, what interested me about it in the context of this conversation was how far those kinds of ghost stories speak against the Enlightenment decision to categorize and to formalize and to structure the living world. I think of Linnaeus and his category of plants and so forth.
Yes.
What you see is the kind of rise also in the 18th century of the Gothic, which is the kind of interrogation of what's left over, the paranormal, the supernatural, the things that we can't quite encounter and categorize. And one of those things is memory.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it struck me that part of what you were exploring there was the memory of of people who have passed in a way that challenges our understanding of individuals and their beginnings and their ends, that it's not a closed life.
No, and I mean, there's a certain cliched value to that, but it's also true that we are inhabited by others, and also true that memory is not fixed, right? I mean, this is quite clear now, or it seems to me quite clear even at a molecular level, that memory is consolidated by emotion and it's reconsolidated by emotion, right? So it keeps changing. Every time you retrieve a memory, it's open to change because you're reconstituting it in some way through your active, mental work. And often it's unconscious. The changes that happen are, no one is intentionally editing an old memory, right? It just happens. It's what Freud called Nachträglichkeit. But I think that in the book that there's an essay, the opening essay is about my grandmother, and I realized that yes, she's been coming back to me, and that the grandmother who's returning is not the grandmother of the mythical familial story. It's somebody else that I have been able to recollect only because I'm my age now and I have my experiences, and I'm a mother, not yet a grandmother, but I'm working on that one. So I think this is, again, a view of life that must include flux.
Yeah, it's. I mean, beg the question. I'll put it. There's a question in the chat which I'll pose first, and I'll come back to this, which is about, you mentioned about being a mother and the question of how life is processed and is mutable. And the questioner is asking if you see it in that way. Has that fed through in contrapoint to the ways in which you think of yourself as a parent? Rather than thinking about how the parenting has informed your thought, do you think it's fed back in a kind of loop?
Yes. I mean, this is a little bit chicken and egg.
Yeah.
Like, how do we really know? And I think openly, I don't know, but I'm 67 years old. I had my daughter when I was 32. So it's a long time ago. But I have been thinking more and more about, for example, I write about this in the book. I'm just introducing what I hope will be a whole book on the subject about the placenta as a between organ and as a philosophical object. What does it mean that, our intrauterine life, and this is not, it's not just for girls, it's for girls and boys and intersex people and everybody who was born.
We're all born.
They're all born, right? What does it mean that there's this transient between organ that, again, has never been considered in philosophical discourse, but has appeared in countless communities and different cultures around the world, and plays a really important role in those cultures. So what happened to us also in the West, in folk cultures, and at when women were in charge of birth, what became medicine later, but was basically midwives helping women to give birth. And then the placenta was often treated with some reverence. It was later that it was jettisoned. And I think it's in 1978. It was in the UK somewhere. There was a conference of obstetricians entitled Placenta, the Neglected Experimental Animal. I came across this in my research, and well, it's such a strange title, but these doctors were basically making the case for what happened to this organ. Why doesn't anyone talk about it?
Yeah.
That's 1978. I mean, in my lifetime, that's when I started graduate school. This is really fascinating.
It strikes me that it's part of that aspect of the ways in which you were describing things coming into a social context. Suddenly vistas can open. Just as much as the memory can kind of lapse and we can lose things, we do have the chance to look forward. I mean, one of the great myths of the Enlightenment is the myth of progress.
Yes.
But it is the capacity at times to see things afresh and see things new and to discover new subject areas of the kind that you're identifying there, that we're in a position now because of political changes, because of medical advancements, that we can start to see things that otherwise hadn't been seen or had been consciously occluded.
That's right.
Taking things out of the narrative, and we can put them back in exciting and interesting ways.
I agree. And so, I think again, in my old age, I've been thinking more and more that omission is a hugely important part of, the work of someone thinking. It's not just what's there. It's being able to identify what's gone missing. And, gestation, birth, the placenta are all part of a missing business in the tradition. Not totally, you find exceptions, but very, very few. And you mentioned natality before, which is Hannah Arendt's phrase. Now, she doesn't, it's rather abstract, her idea of natality, but she does, yes, but she does at least address this idea as a philosophical concept. And she's like, what happened to it? Like, why is it only death? Everyone, after all, was born too.
And she, of course, was a student of Heidegger who was interested in thrownness, and that's part of her challenge against it. Is to say
I think so.
It's a kind of reimagining of human origins itself. But I wanted to, I mean, I'm interested partly because of my own discipline in history about this. This question of the ways in which we can come to see things fresh and new puts up challenges to the narratives that we tell about our own past. Yeah. I wondered how you see, I mean, thinking about this question of the personal histories that you have at the start of your text, how far you think those kinds of hauntings can also happen socially? I mean, we seem to be, in a sense, to think about history not as, Gemeinschaft and sort of, a Gesellschaft and structures of narrative that you can build, from a deep past into a present through a narrative of progress. You're suggesting, I think, at times, if I read you rightly, that we're better thinking of it as kind of social hauntings, ways in which the past haunt the present and shape our understanding. And part of the role then of historians is to unpack that and to rethink it and to reimagine it and re-narrate it. Would that be a fair? I'm trying to think through
no, absolutely.
How that feeds across.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the great things about scholarship, right? I mean, a world without scholars really would be terrible, and a world without historians would be terrible, because I think those rewritings, revisions, right, become crucial. Now, one of my concerns too is, how does that get, in a way, distributed? These other possible ways of telling a story, that they're not only locked inside the university, where a lot of concerned and interested people sit around and have great conversations about and arguments about what to do. And of course, this happened during the Enlightenment too. There were some women involved, but mostly there weren't. And it was not just a European phenomenon, right? This is another thing scholars that are talking about now, how Enlightenment ideas became different forms of what you think of as hybrids. And, what this means, and, the Enlightenment as a kind of Western form of narcissism, like,
Sure.
oh, we're really great, that kind of thing. And what it meant for colonialism, all of this is up for grabs. But what I find in popular discourse is that the more popular the discourse, the more rigid the narrative, right?
Yeah.
And more often you've heard that narrative 5 million times. Now, there's some kind of safety for human beings, right, in adopting what you already know. And I mean that across the board. I think we all take comfort in routine, repetition. This is good for our lives. But when it comes to ideas, especially in light of a pandemic, an ecological crisis, a new war in Europe, I think, we are called upon as citizens to ask ourselves what we want, right? How do we want to live? And what does this have to do with our past, our ghosts, right? So we're haunted by the superiority of science. Now, I happen to be a great lover of science. I read a lot of science. So this is not to say that, we should abandon scientific research, not at all. But I think that the hierarchies that have been established are hurting, collective cultures. And also that we do, again, these ideas, that the hard sciences are masculine and the arts are feminine. Yeah. This runs through the West, and it's very hard to dislodge.
Yeah, I think one of the questions that's being posed in the chat, which speaks to that, is the ways in which there are also sort of set narratives of the right and the left. And part of the problem is brokering those kinds of questions. It's not just a question of hierarchies of gender or structure, but of hierarchies of power that are in place. And we find ourselves in a kind of highly polarized setup at the time, where quite often it's very difficult to meet in the middle and mix and match. So I guess a question comes back to this issue about how those narratives that we construct, can they help or hinder us in imagining that shared middle ground, or are we kind of trapped by our own narrative constructions?
Yeah. These ideological stories, right, and they are narratives, and they have a tendency to get pretty fixed, right? I mean, if you think about the left during the reign of Stalin, in the United States, for example, the apologies for Stalin that went on through collectivization, and some, even later, it's frightening. And I think that what's frightening about it is, of course, that there's a belief narrative, and to depart from that is scary. We see this on the right too, in terms of, circulating fictions that are treated as historical realities. And now how do we fix this? And I think it goes back to my earlier question. Are there some universal moral values, right, that you need to have about hurting other people? That's when the law is supposed to step in, some kind of shared idea about legal restraints. If you beat me up on the street, you're liable. You're not supposed to do that. And I think what's happened is that, especially on the right at the moment, that is up for grabs. Yeah. And it does, play the music of fascism in the 20th century. And we know how far that went. And, the Enlightenment has been partly blamed for this too. I think that's, this is Adorno and Horkheimer's famous essay, that this faith, if you will, in reason develops then into a kind of technocratic control of the world and ends in human slaughter. Now, they don't say that it's inevitable. I mean, that's not part of the argument, but I think we do need to think about what our version of this sort of technocratic, science-oriented, data-driven, evidence-driven world, what this means in human terms, and to what degree it undermines empathy in medicine, in all parts of our world.
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, I think that goes to something that's been raised in the chat as well, very helpfully, which is the kind of Adorno and Horkheimer argument that the Enlightenment actually produces through a dialectic, a kind of counterpoint of social control, speaks to the question of the importance of getting those kind of narratives, if not right, at least making them generous. And under, the kind of narrative that we tell about the Enlightenment will give us something of its legacy, and will help it shape it. And it's because the question that's being raised in the chat, which goes to this, is about the fact that probability theory has, in many ways, taken hold in a lot of physics today. Probability theory was itself an 18th century, late 17th, 18th century construction. So I guess, and the question then is asked, rather than thinking about social control, what you then have is, it opens up the possibility of chaos theory. It opens up the possibility of other kinds of thinking about the natural order. So the questioner is explicitly asking, do you see that kind of probabilistic understanding of the world as inspiring the arts or thinking about human action today? Could that be a way in which we could find a different aspect of the Enlightenment, a different legacy that we could play forward?
This is so fascinating because it's not just in physics. It's been adopted now in neuroscience, Bayesian, the Bayesian brain, the predictive brain, and it's elaborated in hugely complicated quantitative ways, right? So I think this slips in both directions, right? So what probability theory is about is being able to predict, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's an incredibly useful tool. In neuroscience at this moment anyway, there's very little evidence that is actually physiologically how our brains work. It's a model, and it's a model that's become very popular for the reason that it's quantitative, right? So there's control. Now, there are people in physics who argue that applying this kind of predictive mathematical process to biological organisms doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so there is a dispute here. I think what's interesting is the content of the disputes, but also what wins, right? I mean, Margaret Cavendish was pushed to the side for reasons we can all easily imagine. I mean, she was a woman. She was rich, however, she was a gentry and got much more attention than certainly some poor other, philosophy reading woman would have gotten. Or Vico, who keeps popping up, Giambattista Vico, who was an, adamant anti-Cartesian, but still marginal to the tradition. What wins and why? This interests me.
Yeah.
And to ask ourselves, what is the legacy now for us of the Enlightenment, and why does it matter? It matters because we all inherit ideas, and many of them go unexamined.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think part of the task is to live that, to open it up for examination, to see how far, in a sense, some of the, I mean, Margaret Cavendish being a good case in point, that reimagining the possibilities of the Enlightenment and incorporating a figure like Cavendish into the canon of that thought changes not just our understanding of the Enlightenment writ large, but it also changes the relationship of the canon to itself. You start to rework what the possibilities of thought and action were, and you can start to see closures and occlusions in the other writers, the options they had available to them that they didn't take, the possible futures that got lost. I think that's one of the excitements of this kind of encounter, is to think about those engagements and the ways in which, you know, art can reimagine the possibility of the past, but it also opens up to a possible future.
Exactly. And finding, you know, it's like, I compare it to, yeah, discovering intellectual grandparents. And I have an essay coming out in a collection of essays on Cavendish, where, you know, I say she was not an oracle, that what she was dealing with were the same problems that philosophers of biology are dealing with now.
Yeah.
And I do not believe there's no evidence at all that Whitehead read Cavendish, but there are certain parts of their philosophies that overlap in ways that are astounding. And I think it's, again, because they, of course, 300 years apart, nevertheless, the same question is being examined. And it's being examined because there was a failure to properly deal with what may never be properly dealt with, but is an ongoing philosophical question. And yeah.
Brings us back, in a sense, to the possibilities of being human with which we began, the kind of individual autonomies, the individual rights, the ways in which we imagine the individual, which is an inheritance of the Enlightenment, and is challenged by the work of psychiatry and so on. The idea of the kind of autonomous, holistic, working organism is sort of unpicked in many ways through psychiatry, through psychoanalysis, the idea that we actually are narrative-based creatures and so forth. And just in a way of concluding the conversation, I just want to pick up a final question in the chat, which is about how you see your own work in relation to the professions of psychiatry and the ways in which your understanding of that feeds across. Because you've talked about the human being as an organism, and actually it's never settled. That's one of the interesting things. The idea of the Enlightenment is normally understood as a kind of, you know, there's a sort of 40-year-old white male who is somehow propertied, adult and complete. Whereas the whole premise of mental health these days is that it's an ongoing concern. We wax and wane in our mental health, and we're never completely rational, and we're never completely irrational. We live in this interstasis between these two, a kind of between state. Health is an ambition; it's not a lived experience. So I guess that feeds to the question of, which is being raised in the comment about how then you see that interaction. Do you see an engagement in the individual at the heart of that work that you're doing in terms of the novel and your explorations on the other side about neuroscience and so forth?
Yeah, I think, you know, the reality of life on Earth is so complex that it really cannot be answered by a single discipline. And it's really a case of hubris to think that it can, right? So I think my explorations into various fields are really all about that. You know, it's never enough. Nothing is sealed. And the more I know about something, the more critical I become. That I have understood that.
That, I think, is a very good motto and point at which to end. The more we know, the more we realize we ought to be critical of it. I think that speaks to both ambition and humility in equal measure, which is a nice way in which to end that, what I found to be a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to be involved and to engage with it.
I had a great time. Thank you so much, Michael.
Yeah, great pleasure.
And I was just going to say, on behalf of the Lindenhall Library, I'd like to thank you both. I think it was a fascinating conversation, and I'm sure everyone has really enjoyed it. The event has been recorded and will be available on Facebook and YouTube tomorrow. I would also like to thank our main funders for the festival: Belfast City Council, Department for Communities, Ulster Scots Agency, and the Arts Council for Northern Ireland. Also our sponsors, McConnell Chartered Surveyors, Gallagher Insurance and BAC. And I would like to thank everyone for coming along this evening. We've got a couple of more events this week, in-person events at the weekend. So please take a look at our brochure and come along to those as well. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Siri. Thank you, Michael. That's been a great evening.
Thank you for having me. I just feel really good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks indeed. Very enjoyable.